Welcome to today's WinMagic webinar, where we will answer the question, what implications does the Apple, Google, and Microsoft Passkey have for enterprises and their quest to eliminate passwords? I'm Gary McCracken, VP of Technology and CISO for WinMagic, and I'll be your moderator and ask a few questions today. And we're going to have a video brief from Garret Bekker, Principal Analyst at 451 Research. And then Thi, our very own Thi, President and CEO of WinMagic, is going to provide us some deep dive and analysis on this subject. So the agenda, let me set the stage a little bit. For nearly a decade, the FIDO Alliance has been working to reduce the world's reliance on passwords. FIDO stands for Fast ID Online. In May of this year, Apple, Google, and Microsoft took a big step forward when they announced their commitment to expanded support for the FIDO standard to accelerate the availability of passwordless sign-ons. So to do so, they introduced something that the FIDO Alliance calls multi-device FIDO credentials. And Google, Apple, Microsoft, they simply just call these things passkeys. Today, Garret Bekker, the Principal Research Analyst at 451 Research, will lay the groundwork for us, a little bit about MFA, FIDO, and his observations on Passkey. Then Thi will take a deep dive into what this means for enterprises and their journey to eliminate passwords to become more secure and to provide users a better user experience. So to start things off, let's go to Garret.
Hi, my name is Garret Bekker. I'm a Principal Research Analyst at 451 Research, a unit of S&P Global Market Intelligence. My coverage areas include identity and access management, cloud security, and zero trust networking. Well, there are several things that have held back the adoption of MFA. One of which is that multi-factor authentication doesn't necessarily support all the various login scenarios one would encounter in a typical enterprise environment. Now, most people think of MFA as supporting access to applications, but we also have to think about things like logging into desktops and VPNs, as well as infrastructure items like switches, networks, and routers. The other big issue is that not all legacy applications support MFA or the protocols that are needed to use MFA. But I'd say one of the biggest is that MFA suffers from one of the main problems that passwords also suffer from. And that's generally a bad user experience. MFA is typically something you have to carry around. It's something that might be lost or stolen. And in general, it can interrupt your workflows and the way you go about your business on a daily basis. So for that reason, our survey data at 441 Research shows that enterprise adoption of MFA is well below that of other leading security technologies, things like email security, network security, SIM and analytics tools, etc. So people are really excited about passwordless technology, and one of the main reasons is obviously it helps eliminate the use of passwords. Now, passwords are essentially something you know, which can also be considered a shared secret, something like a PIN. And the problem with shared secrets is that they can be often easily intercepted by bad guys. Now, typically passwordless will replace that with either something you have, such as a device or a token, a phone, a laptop, etc., and also with something that you are. That could be a fingerprint, a voice print, a biometric, etc. Passwordless can also use something known as public key cryptography, which uses public and private key pairs to exchange data securely over the internet without fear of being intercepted like the password can. But one of the biggest reasons people are excited about passwordless is that it helps not only offer better security, but also a better user experience overall, which is very rare in security to have both better security and a better user experience.
So Thi, let's pause here for some discussion. One thing that Garret just said, and I wonder if you could explain for us, is how passwordless that uses public key cryptography can lead to better security and usability. Thi?
Thanks to public key cryptography, the server can authenticate the client without knowing the client's secret, the private key. The data is different for each authentication and is practically secure, even if the attacker has own computing power of the world. FIDO adds sequence counter and other mechanism to make it more secure with simple works. So for remote authentication, this is strong, easy to use, and get the most support. We expect it to be the protocol to use going forward with some improvements. The significance of this, though, is that for current cyber attack, none of them would succeed against FIDO. So the adoption of the big OS vendors will be very helpful big time. But some innovation, a new way of thinking may have even bigger impact. We want to contribute, as you see in this webinar. Case in point, just yesterday, July 19, 2023, at 22, Microsoft warned about the adversary in the middle attack. Microsoft says, note that is not a vulnerability of MFA. Since adversary in the middle attack, phishing steals the session cookie. The attacker gets authenticated to a session on user's behalf, regardless of the sign-in method the latter uses. Well, we happen to talk about the session keeping and MFA bypass in the webinar today. Why not the main authentication? This is somewhat about re-authentication, about session cookies, and authentication and verification matter. We might have the prevention today using some adjusted form of FIDO. Let's move on. I can't wait to talk more with you about the Passkey and all these novel things.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Thi. So let me go back to Garret here so he can fill us in a little bit of why the new FIDO standards are so important.
So the new FIDO standards are important because they create what are called passkeys, where essentially a public-private key pair that can be used to replace usernames and passwords. One of the benefits of this and one of the good developments is that it's supported by Apple, Google, and Microsoft, which is definitely a step in the right direction. One of the other interesting features is that it makes it really easy to use across multiple devices, so that if you ever get a new device or one of your devices is lost or stolen, it makes it fairly easy to re-register. Conceptually, you can actually think of passkeys similar to a password manager, although instead of storing passwords, which are easy to crack, it stores public-private encryption keys, which are much harder for bad guys to break.
Okay, some more discussion. So, Thi, could you please explain just what, a little more detail, Apple, Google, and Microsoft are proposing with Passkey? And what's the difference between Passkey and FIDO, which has been around for many years? Thi?
Yes. Note that we don't know everything or the detailed implementation, or even if they are the same between the three OS vendors. So it's about what we know today. Okay? So I think the first one, very important, is that the endpoint is the authentication device. So with the endpoint capable of public key operation and keeping the private key unexposed, the endpoint itself can be the FIDO key. To perform remote authentication, the user only needs to unlock the endpoint using the device biometrics, for example. It means FIDO is the only factor, not as a second factor to the password. It means that the authentication protocol is just between the endpoint and the server with the public key cryptography. No factor like what user is, what user know is in place. In short, there's not MFA. The second point is that the phone can be used as a FIDO device, as an extension of the endpoint via Bluetooth, and thus it can be a portable roaming authenticator. Note that this is different from most phone solutions today, with the phone being used with the network and not via Bluetooth. In fact, we see some very interesting development with the phone as a peripheral device. FIDO has supported USB key for the longest time, so it's time to support the phone via Bluetooth. But it seemed to us the implementation with Bluetooth with the network are more complicated than it could be. So we expect that there are complications in implementation and the involvement of the players. More development will come, and we will analyze a bit more later today about this. The third one is probably very, very important for us because it's about security. So multi-device FIDO key, as opposed to the core idea that the key is not exposable outside of the crypto device. Yeah. So for manageability, especially for the notion that the user won't need to register when having a new device or possessing multiple devices, the private key is managed by some vendor. It will be safe on a server. This is not ideal for security. So is manageability worth it? Can there be other solutions? We want to discuss more as well. The development of the passkey is a big step to make cybersecurity easier. The industry has learned from the past experience, even if slowly. Passkey will be much more secure than password. But by illustrating various findings, we trust the industry can achieve better security and better user experience. The 3OS vendor have the power to add built-in functionalities. Doing that with the technologically correct solution will make it much easier for ecosystem partners to make cyberspace a safe place to operate.
The endpoint as the authentication device. So today's MFA uses mostly the phone. Is the endpoint a better solution?
If you have followed WinMagic we have talked about some new idea in the past year. We would like to analyze the concept, the idea, so the why with what and how the passkey announcement, coincide. So by understanding why, we believe that we can solve some problem better than just knowing what and why. So to recap, our new way of thinking we propose is, first one, no MFA is needed for remote authentication. Second, the server should authenticate the endpoint and the endpoint authenticate the user. Third is to distinguish between the endpoint access from remote access. So MFA is perfect, it's good for endpoint access, not just for remote access. So the passkey does all of the above. We think alike. Remote access is granted when user unlock the endpoint authenticate the remote server without user password or biometrics and so on. So passkey very much go to our new way of thinking. But why doing the number two? Passkey just didn't go far enough to achieve the game-changing benefit of no user action required for remote access. Google states, when you sign in a website or app on your phone, you will simply unlock your phone. Your account won't need a password anymore. So what if your phone is already unlocked? And it is always the case. I mean, when you want to sign in somewhere, it's already unlocked. So does Google mean you do the same local gesture like you do with the phone, like with the PIN or biometrics? But is it really needed? Yeah, you may have just done it a second ago. So do you want to really do it again? So do you agree that if the website want to verify you after you unlock the phone, you shouldn't have to do this local gesture, or maybe within a minute, maybe 2 minutes? So you already have a timeout for screen lock. This timeout is logically probably the same for accessing the endpoint and accessing the remote services. If the endpoint is not confident that using it, it will bring up the screen lock. So if the endpoint also believe that you are not what you are to use remote accesses, it can use a bring up as well. So by adding this way of thinking, you can achieve something extraordinary. No user action is required. Just having endpoint access will give you access to everything else.
Can we trust that the endpoint can always verify that the legitimate user is using it? What if the user left the endpoint and somebody else has it?
We have been asked this question a lot. Thanks, Gary. So, at this point in time, I think we should recognize that the endpoint has always verified the user using it since the endpoint ever exists. So it is a natural thing to do. It's a natural thing to continue to do. Okay? So if the user leaves the endpoint unattended, well, the user should unlock the endpoint first. Yeah? So the endpoint is also in the best position to verify the user much better than a remote server somewhere far away. Yeah? The factor that what you know, what you are, what you have, and so on can be verified best at the endpoint and not with the remote server. So MFA is good for endpoint access, firstly. Having said that, for certain high-value transaction and remote services, we can configure to have explicit MFA if you need. Okay? You can also have more phone proximity, Face ID checking, keyboard behavior, and so on. But that, again, as we think, is more to protect the endpoint, which in turn protect the remote services. There are more to the endpoint. The endpoint is capable of knowing the user intention. I mean, when users want to go to some remote services, the first thing they do is they type it on the endpoint. I want to go to use a VPN, I want to go to Office 365. So the endpoint knows the user intention. It can do all that much better than anything else than the server elsewhere. So the endpoint not only have user presence, it has user intention. So we believe that this new way of thinking go beyond what Passkey is offering. And there are even more. Okay? So you see, no user action in turn allows the server to continue to verify the device and the user with active FIDO-based authentication without user's burden. This fulfills concretely the zero trust principle of always verify. So for enterprises, some further step than the Passkey achieves undoubtedly best user experience and most secure solution with the Aspire zero trust principle of continuous verification.
The second item was that the phone can be the authentication device for the desktop and use Bluetooth in addition to Wi-Fi networks. What's new here? And what's this non-association vulnerability?
This is a very interesting topic for us. Now, let's look at the fact that the US government zero trust strategy mandates employees and contractors to discontinue by January 2023 SMS, OTP, and even passwordless authentication, which use push notification, citing they are not phishing resistant. So we would like to come back to our new way of thinking, particularly the number 2. The server should authenticate the endpoint and let the endpoint authenticate the user. The old way of thinking is that the server should authenticate the user because the user is the one who gets the benefit of the services. But the user doesn't really talk to the server. The server is a machine. And also the user doesn't have much to offer with regard to authentication. So the industry introduced the phone, which represents the user to talk to the server. But that introduced vulnerability, namely the non-association between the phone and the endpoint. So the user can confirm on the phone the authentication, but then the server may be led to serve the attacker's endpoint instead. So that is the push attack, which is increasing in the recent times. So because of this non-association, this solution must rely on user to establish the association, but relying on the user is phishing. It's not phishing resistant, this is phishable. So we believe that the Passkey using the Bluetooth and not just the Wi-Fi is an attempt to establish the association here, to make the solution phishing resistant. But unlike the USB FIDO key, the user with the phone with the Bluetooth and network are not straightforward. We suspect the OS vendor did not make the API available to everybody and to make things run smoothly. So we will see how things develop in the coming months.
So then is the phone, as discussed, as secure as the endpoint if we can take care of the association by say by using a QR code, for example?
I think this, again, very, very interesting. So at this time, I would like to bring another aspect of authentication, which play a very, very big role, the session keeping. Session keeping is a big deal So if your mail server keep on sending you email within a day, after you log in only once in the morning, how secure is it? And then, sometimes the server send you not just within a day, but 30 days. Website like PayPal keep the session forever. So you log in once and then it check, make sure that this endpoint is used and it can serve you without authentication. This cookie, even if encrypted with the server key, is not secure enough against sophisticated attack from today. So this is the MFA bypass used by the SolarWinds attack. This is about the session, the cookie attack Microsoft just mentioned yesterday, I think. Okay, so we can use the FIDO key with the TPM to make the cookie an active cookie. So every time the server wants to make sure the endpoint is valid, the endpoint have to sign the FIDO nonce data. And so that is much more secure than before, and this attack can no longer succeed. So we believe that US government zero strategy is needed, is ahead of the curve because of this SolarWinds and Colonial attacks. So the story is, even if we use a phone or USB token as authentication device, the industry will probably sometime come to use an endpoint to keep the session, endpoint as the authentication device, as an active FIDO device to keep the session open. It is possible, hardware is ready, you just have to have the right software. Going a bit further, we think that you will combine the phone and the endpoint. So you can authenticate to server with both phone and endpoint without doing much, beyond what you do today. So you have portable key and phone, you log in with the key, but then the session will use the phone at the endpoint to maintain the session. So roaming is possible, but then use the TPM, keep the session open.
Okay, thanks, Thi. Well, let's go back to Garret and take a look at, what are the gaps in the new FIDO standards? So here's Garret.
The new FIDO standards are certainly a step forward for the industry. However, we think there are some issues that may leave some questions from an enterprise perspective. Certainly, it appears that the new FIDO standards are mainly for consumer use cases and are particularly for logging into consumer applications and websites. In an enterprise environment, there may be the issue of how to support across Apple, Google, and Microsoft environments, as well as for things like login to desktops, login to VPNs, and log into infrastructure such as servers and databases, et cetera. There's also the issue that the private keys in the public-private key pair are often shared across a cloud environment, which isn't necessarily optimal from a security perspective. So while the new standards are certainly a big leap forward for the industry, we also think there's some work to be done before it's ready to support an enterprise environment.
Okay, so Garret said that the new standards appear to be mainly for consumers, for consumer use cases, and that in the enterprise environment, there's still some issues. One, how to support across Apple, Google, or Microsoft environments. Two, well, there seems to be no support at all for desktop login, VPNs, and servers. And then there's this issue of the private keys are shared across cloud environments, which isn't necessarily optimal from a security perspective and may cause some concerns in the enterprise. So there is some work to be done before it's ready to support for the environment. I guess I should put that as a question. Is there some more work to be done? And maybe you can help us step through these issues, Thi.
First, about the security issue, sharing the key. So people are concerned about locking user to some vendor like Apple or Google ecosystem, or maybe it should be password manager and so on. And FIDO also expects though that upcoming innovation can make things better, which appear to be unsolvable today. But the issue are much more in the core than just concern about. The issue core is, should the key be exposed, share with any other vendor or anybody? The concept of multi-device key or share key is a big compromise, a big price to pay for manageability. Yeah. We have seen that the highest value, the most protected key, the server key, like the RSA secure ID key, or the server key, you protect the cookie in the SolarWinds attack. This key, very much protected, and are still compromised, affected thousands of businesses. So the key, if it's shareable, can be compromised. Non-retrievable key offer a very high level of security, and that high level can make the difference between acceptable risk or not. This high level layer can make every other layer easier to build. So where possible, we should not have the sharing key.
So what can one do without sharing the key? How do you solve this problem?
The requirement is simple: don't share the key. Okay? And this is a solvable problem for businesses and possibly for consumers as well. But let's talk about business today. So the idea is, if you have multiple devices, then have multiple keys. So this is more complex for the server to manage, but it's doable. I mean, enterprise class management software can do all this with ID proofing and everything. So the consideration I have is that the current endpoints are capable of supporting multiple users. The server are capable of supporting multiple user, multiple device, all easily. When user need a new device, the same ID proofing apply for the user to get a new key, a multi-device key, or a completely new key from the new device. All this ID proofing is already established within enterprises. And so by using the new software, the good software, you don't have to change anything. The concept of multi-device key, I believe that will not be needed for enterprises. The private key on the user endpoint alone make all the difference. You will not rely on any ecosystem partner. You will not rely on any vendor. So I think that is very important, and that is doable, especially for enterprises.
Okay, so Garret said the new Passkey doesn't address the support for login to desktop VPN servers. What about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's fair. I mean, they mention consumer and they don't talk too much about the enterprises. For enterprise, of course, you are talking about not only web-based, but also non-web-based. You talk about various protocols and so on. But enterprise have also more powerful tool to deal with IDP and IAM server. And so everything looks okay for me. The important thing is that the concept apply. The endpoint is the key. The IDP can authenticate the endpoint with FIDO-like protocol without user action, regardless of application. And so the concept apply, you can have no user action, you can have just endpoint. You don't need extra devices if it's about remote access. So it's easier for enterprise, and very important, no multi-device FIDO key.
Okay. So we discussed new high-level ways of thinking, but what concretely should a product look like which incorporates these new ways of thinking?
Yeah, I think high level is one thing, but important for all is, what can we do with that? So I think, we can have use phone, USB, on these devices mainly to access the endpoint, and then the endpoint will use its TPM, for example, to access all services without user action. This is important. You have MFA correctly for device and non-MFA because you achieve no user action for all access. And that is much more secure than everything you have today, we believe. Very important as well, you don't need multi-device FIDO key.
Okay, Thi, well, you're doing very well. We're doing very well for time. We have 1 minute left.
Yeah.
I want to thank you and Garret for shedding some light on Passkey and how to move forward on the enterprise passwords journey. We have probably time for one question. Let me just see. We'll go to the Q&A. Oh, here's one you'll like. When can I get a demo? And also I see a poll has just come up on the screen. If people wouldn't mind answering that poll while Thi gives this answer, and maybe we'll wrap up right on time.
Yeah, the answer is now we have released the software. You can see the demo. You can buy the product. I'm happy.
Great. I'll just advance here one more. There's a way to contact WinMagic, sales@winmagic.com, or one of these numbers you see on your screen. Again, thank you very much, Thi, for your in-depth analysis. And Garret, I know you're probably watching. Thank you very much for your contribution and your video brief. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah.